Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. This is the final episode of 2025, and so it's a preview of what I have recorded already for 2026. As of recording this here, 20 December, before it goes out on Patreon at midnight tonight, I have recorded 9 interviews, and so they'll be coming to you in the order that they were most recently recorded, and then that way the next episode that you have coming will be the final preview clip. The guests are, and I'll introduce them in turn between clips, but Jonathan Sedlak, Sara Koenig, Marissa Franks Burt, and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, Eric Harvey, Jennie Grillo, Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat, David Basher, Kirk McGregor, and Alexiana Fry. And so just rolling right in, the first preview that we have here is Jonathan Sedlak. So Jonathan reached out to me. So when I tell you guys, if you have guest suggestions, I mean that. So he reached out to me and he said that his friend Darius Reed, who is I'm quoting his email, he said a big fan of the podcast. So shout out to Darius. I appreciate you taking my request seriously. It means a lot to me that someone could be described as a big fan. Maybe that's hyperbole. I don't need to know that. But so he reached out and we discussed his book, Reading Matthew, Trusting Jesus, Christian Tradition and First Century Fulfillment within Matthew 24 through 25. So here is a preview of that. I will be back after this to set up the next one.
I feel like what I wrote in my book is it will remain a challenge unless more people like Scott McKnight, Peter Leithart, and others, if more people realize that there are real credible scholars out there that are saying the same thing, but like we almost feel like we're not allowed to say this. What's obvious, and it's obvious that tradition is, in this regard at least, of the Olivet Discourse, it's scatterbrained. People are not agreeing with each other. And they're all bouncing ideas around, none of which are entirely coherent. And the fundamental reason for the lack of coherence is, I believe, that everyone's assuming that Jesus answers the first question first and the last question last. And Matthew goes out of his way, uniquely, to show that no, Jesus answers the last question first and the first question last. So to the degree that Christians today are concerned about, this novel interpretation of first century fulfillment, the irony is that the novelty is not with myself or Scott McKnight or others who claim this. The novelty is with everyone who's veered away from what Matthew intended literarily. Because he's the one who presents the evidence we're supposed to be interpreting correctly. The novelty isn't with me. I'm trying to interpret it correctly. And the great thing about my book, again, and this is one thing that I enjoyed while writing it. I wanted everyone to not know how I interpret every verse of the Olivet Discourse. I want the general public to know that my personal interpretations of how does this all fit in the first century? What does this verse mean? How are we supposed to interpret that? I don't care to divulge that, and I don't think the world really cares about my opinion about that. But everyone can see 1,700 plus years of answering that question. How does this verse fit? How does that verse fit? And they can see for themselves that the dissonance can be attributed to a couple misunderstandings. One of them, the most important one, is presumptions about the way in which the order in which Jesus responds to the question.
So on that note, is there a literary or rhetorical reason to say, yes, absolutely, it would fit within these ancient literary or rhetorical traditions that Jesus would go last verse, first last in his answer?
There could be like allusions to last verse, first last with statements of Jesus. I would not pair it with that. There may have been like common oral traditions about how to view it, but in terms of literary evidence, I am operating with literary structures that are grammatically justifiable, not just thematically justifiable, to show that this is the way that scribal culture would organize documents that are intended to be read. And I dabble a little bit in my book, mostly through footnotes, showing that there are other gospels, there are other writings that were meant for communal reading rooms. They were meant for an oral culture, like Mark's gospel would have been one of those. I don't believe that Matthew's would have been. I think Matthew's was actually made for scribes, and it was made for studying, and it was one of those expensive books. It was not one that was meant to leave the local community reading room, the local synagogue, the local anything. It was not meant to leave it. It was protected and preserved and used and closely examined by everyone who had a version of it. Another scribe in another community copying it and having it. I mean, it's by far the most cited of the synoptics early on. It's definitely the most common found, and that's why it's the most influential. Scholars in the modern era can pontificate about everything being based upon Matthew or some Q source, or some Ur Marcus, all these different theories, which have actually a lot of interesting ideas in them. My personal opinion is we shouldn't throw all that stuff out. We should try to understand it. But even if we try to operate with those modern systems, it doesn't really affect the artifact that ends up in the local communities and what they study.
Okay. This next preview will be from Sara Koenig, and we're discussing her book, The 10 Commandments Through the Ages, and this does come up in the interview, but this is a companion piece to Rebecca Eklund's The Beatitudes Through the Ages. So they're a few years apart, but Eerdmans decided that these were portions of biblical texts in both the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, respectively, that I think they wanted people to have some kind of an understanding of the reception history. So that's what this covers, is how between Jewish and Christian traditions throughout history, the 10 Commandments have been received. Okay. Here's Sara Koenig.
So there's obviously a lot of similarities. The 10 Commandments get repeated in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, as I've said multiple times, with some differences. And some of the differences are quite minor, such as a preposition in one that doesn't occur in the other. I think there's something like 20 quite minor differences. Some of the more substantial differences include the rationale for keeping the Sabbath. Both Exodus and Deuteronomy have the commandment to keep a Sabbath. But according to Exodus, the reason why we keep a Sabbath goes back to the Genesis 1 story in creation, that God rested on the seventh day. And therefore, that's why we humans are to create a Sabbath. In Deuteronomy, when the Sabbath commandment is given, the rationale goes back to the Exodus, or before the Exodus, that the reminder is you were slaves in Egypt and God brought you out of there, therefore keep a Sabbath. And so in the different, again, the commandment is the same, but the reason why, the motivation is different between Exodus and Deuteronomy. So that's the main substantial difference. Another difference has to do with the coveting commandment. In Deuteronomy, you have the addition of don't covet your neighbor's field. And many have thought that that's because the Israelites are about to enter into the promised land where they will own land. And so they want to include field as a specific thing not to covet, even though both covet commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy have that catch-all, anything that belongs to your neighbor. But the other coveting difference is that in Deuteronomy, it says, do not covet your neighbor's wife first, whereas wife is included a little bit later on in the list in Exodus. And so because Deuteronomy says don't covet your neighbor's wife and then don't covet all these other things, some people who list out the 10 commandments, separate out the coveting command into 2 separate commandments. So a single commandment, don't covet your neighbor's wife, and then second, don't covet everything else that your neighbor has, which gets into another issue with the 10 commandments of how do we number 10? How do we get to 10? So the reason we have 10 commandments has to do with Exodus 34:28, and that's after the golden calf incidents, after Moses had broken the 2 tablets, the original 2 tablets, and then the covenant gets remade with God in Exodus 34, and Exodus 34:28 specifies that he wrote on the tablets the words of the commandments, the 10 words. So we get the number 10 from that verse in Exodus. So everyone refers to them as the 10 commandments, but not everyone agrees on which one is number 1, which one is number 7. For example, there's different ways of ordering. So kind of running on here. I don't know if you want to interrupt and ask the clarifying question.
Nope.
So again, everyone agrees that there are 10 based on that verse in Exodus 34:28. But the major differences have to do with which one is number 1 and the early ones and then the later ones. So in Judaism, their first commandment is something that Christians tend to treat as the prologue, which is the statement, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, period. So for Jews, that's word number 1. And then the second one would be no gods, no idols. And I find that really interesting because there's nothing explicitly commanded in that statement. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And yet it's been explained as there's an implied commandment. Know that God exists. Know that God is your God. And then also remember what God has done for you. So there's no direct imperative in that statement. And yet there's an invitation there to know God, to be in a relationship with God, to remember what God has done. So again, in Judaism, that's the first word. The other place that there's disagreement between how you divide them has to do with the commandment about worshiping God and worshiping other gods. So is no gods, no idols a single combined commandment, or is it separated out into 2 distinct commandments? Different Christians have divided that differently throughout the ages. Some saying one commandment is don't have any other gods. And then the second commandment, don't make an idol, would be more in reference to prohibiting making any image of that one God that you're already worshiping. You're not worshiping any other gods. It's a separate command. And then don't make an idol or an image of that God. Or a lot of people combine those into a single commandment. No gods, no idols. Don't worship anything else besides God.
All right. Next up is a preview of my conversation with Marissa Franks Burt and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, and we're discussing their book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. As with a lot of books, the title is much more inflammatory and attention-seeking than the book itself is. This is a very helpful assessment of the history of parenting books in general, the nexus between self-help and parenting, and just the notion of success as a good metric or rubric for whether or not you're doing a good job parenting, and what the duties and roles and responsibilities and things like that are. And considering how central an understanding of family is to our understanding of society and humanity, I think this is a really helpful rehashing of some historical questions, or they are asking some very good questions of the history of this movement, rather than just accepting it at face value for what it is now. And I think we can fall prey to the idea that whatever the discourse at the moment is, it must have always been this way, and that is not the case. So yeah, here's that preview. Pick that book up. Yeah, it's a helpful assessment of a world that we live in. Here is a preview of my conversation with Marissa Franks Burt and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis.
We're having conversations about parental rights, basically because of those three things, because of gender, because of putting children online and children's safety online, and education. These are all hot button issues. Education has been like the center point of this for a long time, like since the 80s, right? There was a major evangelical movement to get prayer back in schools or get the kids out of public schools and put them into Christian schools or homeschool, right? And that kind of happens in waves. We are in some ways in an upswing of that right now. Where I live in Iowa, the school voucher movement is very animated by Christians who want to be able to put their children in schools where they won't be exposed to certain ideas. They want more control over what their children hear and see and learn. So I think, these are the arenas where conversations about parental rights play out. And evangelical critics of of people who talk about children's rights will often say, well, this is a symptom of this hyper individualized society, right? Like this is this atomized individualism that's telling children they can be whatever they want, that they don't have any duties to a community. They don't need to be connected to a community in any way. And there is a whole body of Christian philosophy. Alistair McIntyre is a virtue ethicist who writes a lot about balancing the autonomy of the individual within the context of a connected community, right? Like that is a tension that he has been writing about for decades. This is not a new problem. There is a lot of thought that we can look to that lays a foundation for people who want to say, my child has their own will. They are their own person. I want us to be a connected community that supports and loves and cares for one another, but not at the expense of my child's individuality and their needs. A lot of the time, evangelicals just do a really bad job of making this an either or situation, right? Like if you give an inch toward these children's rights people, the government is going to take your children away. I mean, that's basically where this is. Like if you give these people an inch, they're going to let your child give themselves a name and go off and join some kind of government thing and you'll never see them again. I mean, it's catastrophizing all the way through. When the real answer is that this is a really messy process, but children are their own individuals with their own individual wills and individual needs, and they are not pets and they are not machines. They can't be programmed, and unless you are someone who ascribes to a very particular version of behaviorism, you cannot program your child to behave a certain way. So we have to grapple with the dignity of children, with what we owe them, what we can expect from them ethically. And the uncomfortable reality is the Bible just doesn't deal with that directly. So we have to look to the person of Christ for an example of what to do with that. And when you look to the example of Christ, you see someone who valued children, right? Who says things like, you have revealed your kingdom to these, and I think that is uncomfortable and it is messy and it defies the formulaic thinking that people want from a Christian parenting book. And that there's not an easy answer there.
Next up, our return guest, Eric Harvey, had him on early on in the podcast, and I really enjoyed that. He reached out to me to let me know, hey, I have this new book. It's with the Cambridge University Press Element series, and I had noticed some scholars posting these out there on Twitter or whatever, because it's like when it released for the first 2 weeks, it was just open access. So yeah, he reached out to say, hey, if you're interested, which of course I am. I had a great time talking to him last time. But this one, it's 80 something pages, the book in total. And I went and looked, and without back matter, so any other resources or references or anything, at the end of the book, it's not even 70 pages. I think it's 67 pages, if memory serves me. Yeah, so the book is Reading Creation Myths Economically in Ancient Mesopotamia and Israel. And so this is one of those times that we're taking a modern concept in how we understand the world, so in this case, economics, and applying it to an ancient world where they conceptualize the world differently, which is not to say incorrectly, but in applying our whether it's techniques or methodologies or modalities, however you want to look at it, applying them to the ancient world to get a better understanding. So looking at the economics behind creation myths in Mesopotamia and ancient Israel, it is a helpful lens to see these things through. So, yeah, I won't spend all day talking about that. Here's a preview of my conversation with Eric Harvey, and I'll be back to set up the next one. So things that I was raised with, like as I'm reading through the kind of recounting of the ancient Mesopotamian creation myths, and you're pointing out that like, well, here was the reason for the creation of humanity, and it's this is, and I'm like, I don't know how he's going to do that with the biblical creation story, and I realized I had this kind of a foundational understanding of creation as an end in and of itself, and that ends up being a thing, but kind of alongside that, there is the, I'm born in the 20th century here. I'm an adult in the 21st century. So the understanding of economics as like a more, I guess, complex or graduated or elevated understanding of the things that these people were associated with gods. Like we see ourselves as separate from that, but you're attributing economic motivations or understandings to these creation myths. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think I would say I'm trying to sort of undo a constriction of what we refer to as economics that's happened in the 20th century, following particularly what's called the neoliberal turn, where the economy gets sort of separated from the rest of life and extracted as its own unit of analysis. And it's been really an attempt to treat it almost akin to a natural science, right? But there's this separation of economy from life that is really, when you get right down to it, untenable, because everything we do that requires stuff has economic ramifications, right? Even a lot of the most abstracted things, the most thinky, non-manual labor type of things, nevertheless rest on these vast and like deeply entangled economic processes and chains and flows of materials and labor and money. And so religion in particular is also has a highly economic side that we just try to suppress in a lot of our discourse, right? Religious buildings have to be built. Religious professionals have to be paid. They have to, make enough money to eat. Materials for our weekly services and other parts of religious life together have to be purchased. Everything in religion has an economic component. And on the flip side, like economics, the way that we exchange goods, money, labor, exchange or compel or volunteer, etc. All of those things are economic, but they are also deeply, deeply conditioned by the realities of our social existence, right? They are so culturally inflected by the structure of our society, by the nature of relations between classes, between genders, between people groups, right? Like trading partners, etc. All of these things are all economic and social. So I really treat economics as a social science or component of anthropology rather than as a hard science, as you'll often have it taught in economics classrooms in universities today, right?
Yeah. So, would you mind walking us through the way you not to the level of detail, but through these creation myths, kind of building up to the biblical creation
Yeah,
story?
I'll sketch out. I treat 3 creation myths in the book: Atrahasis, Enki and Ninmah, and Enuma Elish. And really, Atrahasis is where I focus most of my attention because it's the most detailed example of this motif. And so, to make this clear, the ideology of divine service and the temple system and its relationship with the palace, as I said, that emerged in hazy prehistory via some processes we don't completely understand. So by the time these myths were written, the origins of that system, like it was just what probably seemed like a natural and eternal component of city life, and its origins were lost. So we have then the creation of mythological narratives to explain the origins of the system, right? As Russell McCutcheon says, the purpose of mythology is to create a mythic originary point that anchors what is presently existing in this mythic originary moment, right? And so what these myths do is give an explanation for the existing ritual economic system and political economic system that is anchored in creation itself.
Okay. This next preview is from my conversation with Jennie Grillo, and we discuss her article from the Journal of Biblical Literature on having a body, time, and divine embodiment. It's weird to come across a topic like embodiment and realize you just kind of take for granted that you understand what it is to be embodied or what embodiment means because you have a body, and to just run smack dab into a wall that makes you think about something that it's just, it's like the water that you swim in. Thinking about the air that you breathe is not something that you do. You breathe it, you don't think it. But it is a helpful exercise to be exposed to a scholarly or academic approach to attempting to understand and unpack this topic. So here's a preview of my conversation with Jennie Grillo.
Is it really that we're being shown a God who is here one minute, not there, who looks like this in one place and like this in another place? And so I thought that was a reasonable question, and I did then go back and look and see whether that was a complete explanation for the kinds of sort of choppiness in God's self-presentation that I was seeing in Genesis. And I don't think it is, even though sure there are some distinctions. The God of the J source is, more physical, if you like, whereas in P or E, if there's such a thing, you get more of a sense of appearance without such a specification of a body. Nevertheless, at a redactional level, those are all being presented as the same self who doesn't have a consistent bodily self-presentation. So the inconsistency is real.
That's an interesting that there are diverse perspectives that are all kind of feeding toward. We're talking about the same. I guess being is tough because I'm still. I won't say confused, but I am still having trouble wrapping my head around. And I think I may have put something to this effect in the questions. I think I was operating under the impression that like consciousness is the most foundational aspect of being rather than embodiment. So I don't know if I'm taking the conversation backward and bringing that up.
I will, maybe I wasn't trying to address what's the most foundational aspect of being, simply the question of, is God straightforwardly embodied? Does he have a body in Genesis? And I was just suggesting that it looks from the way that this you could also say a character in the narrative, this self, this actor, God doesn't, although he's presented by the kind of final form of the text as a continuous self, doesn't have a continuous bodily presentation in the way that we normally mean when we talk about a self that has a body.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't mean to. I worry that it is a digression on my part. So there does seem to be some overlap for the people who are saying God has a body between or attempting to read Hebrew Bible as, I guess, largely continuous with the religious and theological understanding around the development of Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East. And so I started wondering immediately, like, well, is there a lot of continuity? And you mentioned, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Cathar, Wahasis, and Danil. That this is this is a narrative in an adjacent culture. Do you mind explaining what that is and how that relates to this article?
Sure. And this is not my idea. So many scholars have compared this tale with Genesis 18, because you have the same sort of situation. You have Abraham and Sarah, who are visited by God, who accepts their hospitality and promises them a son. You have the hero Daniel having this god Kothar come visit him, and it's just a parallel narrative. Other scholars have made that comparison before. What interested me about it was how differently the god in each case seems to occupy space and time. So in the Ugaritic narrative, you get a sort of perspective from the viewpoint of Daniel, of seeing the god come. He sort of approaches from across the fields, and he looks up and sees him coming, sees him walking, and kind of walking a long way, big steps, divine, whatever. But he's still walking through time, and he's got to get there. And then when he's eaten and drunk with Daniel and his wife, and given them gifts and gone away again, he gets up and goes home. And the text says that he leaves for his tent, his dwelling. Whereas in Genesis 18, Abraham looks up, and there is God. He's there. He didn't come. He's just suddenly there. And then at the end, there isn't that same. He went off to his place, even though Abraham, goes off to his goes between places in the narrative. And I mentioned a couple other sort of type scenes in Genesis where there are encounters between people at wells. It's a sort of stereotype almost, but you always get the coming and going and the time it takes for people to pass through the landscape. That just doesn't happen with God in Genesis. So that would be a little contrast with the presentation of a God in a cognate culture. I'm not at all though saying that this is an absolute contrast. And there's a diversity of ideas in the cultures around the Bible as well about the extent to which gods have bodies like humans. And it wouldn't be surprising if there was a shared understanding that the God isn't embodying quite the same way as we are.
Next up, this is a preview of my conversation with Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat on their book Colossians Remixed. Colossians Remixed has had a huge influence on me. It is a book that since I read it back in 2005, I changed the way I voted. I'll let you get to the full conversation because we do discuss that a little bit. I won't go into that here quite so much, but it is a book that I have thought about a great deal in the last 20 years. I set it down one day and just thought, I can't vote the way I vote anymore. And, it kind of being connected with a lot of the NT Wright, I would say, in the words of Dr. Laura Robinson, one of the hosts of the New Testament Review podcast, and also, coincidentally, wife of friend of the pod, John Depew, that what she describes NT Wright as is baby's first biblical studies, I think is how she put it. And that is absolutely the case. He is my Fisher Price, my first biblical studies. And I say that without any shame. I have a great deal of appreciation. And knowing that there was a nexus between them is part of the reason that when my friend Nate Finch started speaking so highly of this book, I grabbed it. And it's a book that I've bought copies of for people over the years because it was so important to me. It was so helpful for me. And it blended so many things that I was either already interested in, like biblical studies, or would become interested in. And so an example of that, which does come up in the conversation, is Naomi Klein's No Logo. It features very prominently. And then there were some political other kinds of political thinkers that were in the book that I was already aware of. And so, yeah, they compiled so many things that were so appealing to a 22-year-old and have stood the test of time to where a 42-year-old who's trying to revisit some of those things and still work through and understand most of those things that he was introduced to 20 years prior. I was so eager to have them on the podcast and, just chip it away and probably going into people's spam folders. There are, people I still haven't booked on the podcast that meant a lot to me in my early 20s that influenced my thinking even now. And I'm super excited to say that, I booked and recorded an interview with Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat, and hopefully there will be more. I just need to do the assigned reading, which is I need to get some Wendell Berry under my belt because Brian told me that was a condition for them coming back. So that's enough yammering from me. Here is a preview of my conversation with Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat about their book Colossians Remixed, which you should buy and read. Okay, I'll be back in a few minutes.
I think that the language of inevitability is really interesting language because you have again and again in the biblical story places where you're at a point in the story where an outcome seems inevitable, right? So Abraham and Sara, they have this promise, yes, but they can't have children and they're both near 100. It seems inevitable that it's not going to happen. And yet God brings new life and new possibility. And where do we see that nation that's promised to them? We see it first in the Exodus, where they are slaves, and it seems inevitable that this is the end of the story. I mean, Egypt's not going to let their slaves go. No culture ever wants to let their slaves go en masse as a people. And yet God intervenes, and the inevitability of that ending isn't carried forward, right? The exile, it seems inevitable that this is the destruction of a people, and yet a remnant returns. Jesus dies. It seems like that's the end of the story, right? And then resurrection happens. And so what we have again in the biblical story, and I think that's what we face now too, in terms of climate destruction, this world spiraling inevitably into more violence, is we worship a God, and our life is rooted in a story in which resurrection is always possible. And you're right, love is the word for what lies behind everything that God wills for the world, for that resurrection and redemption. It grows and is nourished by God's love for us and for creation and for all creatures. And so as we think about our own context, and I think this is what Paul was saying to the Colossians too, when he talked about, a hope in heaven, this hope that's above what we can see with normal sight, is that in the face of inevitability, the language of inevitability, which is the language of empire actually, is that there is always possibility. The biblical story is always saying that God makes possible the impossible. And if we are truly going to live into that story, we need to live as if that future hope that the biblical text sets before us of a new heaven and a new earth, of all things reconciled in Jesus, we need to live as if that's actually the reality. And we are living into that reality, even though it doesn't seem like we have no idea how it could be possible.
So that there's a line there. There's a famous, in my life, Sylvia Keesmaat line that got hidden in what she just said. And the line is, inevitability is the discourse of empire. Inevitability is the discourse of empire. Empire always wants you to think that it's inevitable. Resistance is futile. That this is simply where history is going and it cannot be countered, right? And the gospel is the discourse of gospel is resurrection and promise and opening. The gospel opens up life to God's intentions, opens up life to shalom, opens up life to justice in the face of what seems to be inevitable. So inevitability is the discourse of empire.
Okay, next preview is my conversation with David Basher, and we discuss his Journal of Biblical Literature article, Saul and the Not So Holy Ghost, 1 Samuel 16, 14 through 23, and Ghost-Induced Illness. I don't talk enough about things like this on the podcast, and part of that is my slapdash approach to booking guests. It's not as well-formed a process as I would like, in that there is very little process to it. Aside from reaching out to everyone in each new volume, I guess, of the Journal of Biblical Literature, it's a lot of me just kind of scrolling through social media, seeing that something has been or will be published, and then commenting, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast. Other than that, yeah, I don't really have a system, and I need to work toward that because, look, questions of embodiment, questions of what the substance of material reality is, these are things that I want to talk about. And so getting an understanding of what ancient people thought about ghosts and ghost-induced illness was fun. It's interesting, and I need to do a better job of locking in on covering these things. So, okay. Yeah, I will leave it at that and say, here's a preview of my conversation with David Basher.
We do need to, in my opinion, understand their historical context, understand what did they think was going on. And from that, we can figure out what is going on ourselves. The problems with truly medically diagnosing Saul is that all we have to go off of is a narrative depiction of Saul. We don't have anything else. We don't have any more information about who Saul is, about besides these little pieces of narrative. It's typically considered bad practice to diagnose someone with a mental health issue if you've never actually met them. And so part of the problems with some of these modern attempts to diagnose Saul is with the fact that we don't really have the real Saul. We have a presentation of Saul in the book of Samuel that has been edited, that has been compiled over hundreds of years. So we can't accurately diagnose Saul. The most we can say is, what did they think was going on? And sure, we could throw out a bunch of modern medical terms to describe it, and maybe we'd have it right, but there's no way of knowing. And so our best bet here is simply to look at what did the people who wrote this text think was happening.
So not knowing necessarily too much about the interpreters who would label Saul as bipolar, it does seem to be in line with a certain approach to biblical texts that considers them as like discrete or immediate representations of historiography in the way that we know it now, like a journalistic representation of the events that they describe. And maybe that's not the way that some of the interpreters you're thinking of, but that's where my mind goes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I'm not going to speak for what those interpreters were trying to do, because I don't want to mischaracterize their work. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it at they will often describe Saul's illness in modern medical terms that I think can be problematic when we understand the biblical text as a ancient compilation of narratives.
I just this phrase comes to mind. I remember reading an article in the Westminster Theological Journal, like I think in 2004, and it was about the flood narrative, and the person said this is not a VCR account, and even in 2004, that term was kind of dated. I don't know that by the time I read it, I could find or VHS of new movies anymore. But now,
do you need to explain that for your audience real quick so they are following?
Yeah, so VHS were these. Well, I was about to say these big like cassette tapes, but I guess I would have to go back even further. It was like a strip of film in a box that you would put in another box, and that box would show you the film on your TV. And you could record TV shows with it, but you had to be set to channel 3. But I kind of think about that I think about that phrase a lot because it was helpful along with some other stuff I was reading around that time of framing, like consider these as texts that developed over a long period of time. And I bring that up because that is how you describe, in this case, Samuel. Like this is a text that's built up over time. It accumulates, and we're reading the story and doing your best is looking at the world around that to see like how does it resonate. So I think I'll try to stop with this particular digression at this point. Okay, here we are. We're at the penultimate preview, and this one is with Kirk McGregor. This is also from the Journal of Biblical Literature, and the article is The Pro-Choice Biblical Ethics of American Evangelical Scholars Before the Religious Right. And yeah, that's, much like the myth of good Christian parenting, it's an inflammatory title. And this is a chronicle of the history and substance of a thing that happened in 1968. So if you heard, or maybe you're reading the show notes and you read that title and you're turned off by that, that's fair. That's fine. I would ask you to hear him out. Yeah, it doesn't have to match up with your point of view to still be someone, reasonably and professionally assessing a thing that happened. So I enjoyed my conversation with him. It, not being necessarily an attempt to exegete a passage in its entirety, in the roughly 20 pages that an article lasts, he's more looking at how were these evangelical scholars and biblical experts, how were they looking at the biblical text at that time? And we do discuss the change that happened since that 1968 symposium. So it's a history that we would all do well to learn more about, regardless of our individual opinions on the issue of human reproduction. So, yeah, here's a preview of my conversation with Kirk McGregor, and I will be back to set up the last clip in a few minutes. To that point, How was the symposium's conclusion received by women?
It was received very well. Evangelical women who commented on the symposium cited it approvingly. So Letha Scanzoni, who is the wife of one of the symposiists, she wrote a book called Sex is a Parent Affair, I believe was the title. And astonishingly, in retrospect, the book was endorsed by James Dobson. James Dobson wrote the foreword for the book and says, her recommendations in this book are sound. These are biblical principles. This is what we should do. And in that book, she argues for a pro-choice case and takes the most liberal perspective by modern standards of the word liberal, the most liberal perspective of any of the perspectives that was taken at the symposium. So at the symposium, as I said, everybody was in agreement that mother's life is at risk, child's life is at risk, rape or incest, that called for an abortion. Where there was controversy, and only a minority would go this far, would say, like, if socioeconomic factors were in play, or when psychiatric factors or psychological factors were at play. And there were some, like 4 of the evangelical scholars, who cited the position of the believer's freedom, which you find in, for example, Romans chapter 14, in the book of Galatians, where the book of 1 Corinthians, where the believer is said to have freedom on disputed issues. And on disputed issues, people aren't to judge others. People are to let others hold whatever view is in their conscience before God. And that there isn't, that this should not be a matter of division. And so there were 4 who said, yes, really there should be almost no restrictions on abortion, or at least abortion could well be considered for things like psychiatric reasons or psychological reasons or for socioeconomic reasons. And that was the position that Letha Scanzoni actually takes in that book, and which Dobson endorses. Amazingly, it's like, this is the same guy who, 4 years after approximately, would go on to found Focus on the Family. It's pretty unbelievable. And there were several other women evangelicals who essentially said the same thing. There was an evangelical women's journal called Daughters of Sara, where they devoted one of their reader response type sessions to the issue of abortion. And there were several women who praised the book, the book of the collected papers of the symposium, the 500 and whatever page book it is. And yeah, it was well received all around by evangelical women at the time. And it really wasn't until the scare strategy by Schaeffer and Koop that evangelicals began to think, abortion, that's linked to secular humanism, that's linked to godlessness, that's linked to depriving human beings of their basic rights, all of that. And then it's almost like, well, we need a biblical case to substantiate that. And then it's like, let's sort of scavenge through what's already out there to see if we can't find a biblical case. And so this biblical case was first become widespread. So there's one web article which talks about this by describing this as the biblical view that's younger than the Happy Meal. Because the Happy Meal is actually older than the widespread nature of this biblical case against abortion.
That wow, I did. How old is the Happy Meal? All right. here we are. Last preview, and you'll be able to hear this very soon. I'm super excited for Alexiana Fry to kick off 2026 as the first episode, because I think she's absolutely wonderful. If you don't follow her on TikTok or Instagram, she puts up some really good material as a biblical scholar, and interesting little book reviews and explainers and all kinds of things. I really enjoy seeing what she puts out there. And I will tell you this, just not having a large social media following just yet, I see who gives me feedback and who's liking things, and she is, for sure on TikTok. She's in there all the time, and it really warms my heart to see that this person, I had on early in the podcast, paying attention and being kind enough and thoughtful enough to throw some love my way and throw some love the way of the podcast. So I really appreciate her coming back on. She has a book coming out in March, so I will have her back on as soon as I can have her back on. I'm not even worried about crowding the episodes too closely together for her. But this episode in particular, we're discussing her Journal of Biblical Literature article. I went pretty hard. I got quite a few JBL yeses, and I believe these are all in the same issue, drop, volume. I don't know. But it's Don't Feel It, Don't Heal It, Ezekiel 24:15 through 27, and Divine Dissociation. So much like with Eric Harvey, she's taking concepts and approaches that academics in contemporary world use to understand humanity and human life, and she is applying those to an ancient text. And it's helpful. It's helpful not just in understanding the biblical text, but I will tell you, it's helpful for me to understand me, because I was aware on some level intellectually of what dissociation was, and had not internalized it, and until I saw it connected with something that I could understand, and that is this narrative here of Ezekiel losing his wife and being told not to mourn, and that being a prophetic message for Israel, that they should also not grieve for, a scaled up, equally devastating thing for a people to go through. So since this is the final preview, I will do, my normal pitch of, if you're listening out there and you like these previews and you plan on coming back to the podcast to hear any or all of them, please subscribe or follow whatever your platform of choice calls it, so that you'll get that automatically. Those downloads mean a lot to me. And recommend it to friends. And you can do that by following and supporting and, liking and sharing things on social media. Everything from Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Threads, Spoutable. I feel like I might be the only person I hear talk about Spoutable, and that's okay. I'm trying to cover all my bases, but any of those you could follow. They're in the show notes here. That means that'd be a big deal. And look, if you want to be like Jonathan Sedlak's friend, Darius Reed, and either reach out directly or reach out to the person you would like to have on and say, like, hey, this is a guest who's worth having, or hey, to if you know someone, hey, you are a guest worth having on this podcast. Probably the best way to reach out to me directly is itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. That's all one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. I do check my spam folder very regularly just to make sure I'm not missing anything if someone does reach out. Nothing legit, I don't think, has come through there so far. But yeah, hit me up. Let me know who you'd like to have on, what you'd like to hear me talk about, or, maybe what I'm doing well or what I'm doing poorly. But here's the thing, man. I would love to be able to do this as a day job. Reading people's work and talking to them about that work, or connecting with people for whom their religious or spiritual tradition is really important. I want to do that. I want to do that full time. And so one of the things, chatting with Jonathan Sedlak after the interview was done, I asked him if he had any feedback for the podcast, and he said that he appreciated that I'm not trying to sell people anything. Okay, look, I don't have a big enough audience to have ads in the podcast. And I'm on the fence as to whether I will or not. There are days I'm for sure hard in the paint. I'll have ads on this podcast once I have a big enough following. And there are days that I feel really uncomfortable about that. And ultimately, what I would like to have is a big enough base of support on Patreon that I don't ever have to do ads at all. And that all I ever have to do is ask the free audience to consider chipping in $5 a month. And when you think about it, the number of people that I would need to chip in at $5 a month in order for this to become my day job is not that big. I do not have to have a massive following. I am not looking to be Joe Rogan. I am not looking to be Ezra Klein or Amy Poehler. And nor do I think I ever will be. And I could be absolutely fine with that if what I get to do is read articles and books and have interviews with people who have worked really hard to research and understand something, or are part of a tradition that is the center of their understanding of the world, and that I can learn more about their work, their life, their tradition. So to do that, use the link in the show notes. Go to patreon.com, chip in $5 a month if you really want to give the ultimate level of support. That said, I appreciate any of those, we'll call them tiers, that you could, whether it's simply listening and getting downloads to come in for free as they show up once a week, or following on social media, engaging on social media, reaching out to me individually through email. But definitely the more people I see sign up for $5 a month, the closer I will get to the goal of being able to pay my bills and do this thing this is really exciting for me, that I get to talk to people about things that are important to them, and I get to learn more. So have a happy new year. I hope your 2026 is great. And without further ado, here is the final preview of 2026. I'll be back next year.
So instead of doing the mourning processes, they are to put on their headwear or their turban and to put on their sandals. And she reads that as a marital ritual, in that they are going through a change of status. They are becoming, they're going through they're creating a new covenant. They're becoming the chosen bride of the deity, instead of the people that they are now severing from, right? The people who are back in Jerusalem, they're no longer a part of this. They are not the chosen people. We are, right? And so we don't need to mourn. She actually writes, because it's a marital ritual, this is good news, right? She writes, quote, "Even if this seems like a denial of their grief, the exiles escape neither their pain nor their responsibility." That's all well and good. But then she writes, "Grief is not always a good teacher. Ezekiel 24 is attuned to this understanding of the seductiveness of mourning." And I'm like, okay, it would be one thing if if they were allowed to mourn at all, but they're not. It's not as if he's like, okay, you guys have been doing this for a while. Can you not? No more. Your wife just died, and your family members and the temple is all going to get destroyed. Don't cry at all. Don't worry. I got this. We're going to get married. It's a little spiritual bypassy.
Yeah, that didn't, I don't know, it didn't seem to mesh with, like a more positive reading didn't really seem to mesh with when I actually read the passage.
Mm-mm.
And that's where one of the things I knew I threw in there was the phrase "pine away in your iniquities," and that's from the NRSV UE that I was reading.
Yep.
But I was like, well, it sounds like they're not mourning to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
and they're in a situation where Adonai thinks they should be, and so this, like, I'm going to kill this person, but you don't mourn to reflect back to them what they look like not mourning, and they're just going to continue to pine away in their iniquities.
They're going to be consumed by their iniquities.
I don't read that as a particularly positive thing.
No. And there are some people who read that and they're like, well, see, he lets them groan to one another, right? That's part of the other half of that verse, right? You will be consumed by your sins. Pine away is another way of translating that. And you can groan to one another. And so some people have read that and they've been like, oh, well, they can talk to each other then. Like, it's fine. I'm like, well, there's a differentiation between grief and groaning and engaging in the public ritual and relational practices that would help them come to terms with acceptance and healing. Instead, they are cemented in, and actually it's interesting that you brought up earlier, they're cemented in this ritual of, they are ritualizing the severing of themselves from their family members, from what was, instead of actually mourning and grieving. Like, let's just move right to the thing, right? Let's just move right into action. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to feel. I mean, you can kind of feel on the side, but we're not going to do this. We need to just get...
So bear with me, because I'm not really sure what the connective tissue is here, but I read Homosociality and Male Friendship by Barbara Tita. Okay. And I mean, the explanation there seems to be like, well, Adonai is a character who is interested in his own honor throughout Hebrew Bible. And that's kind of the point. And that's the point of the story. And I got a visceral sense of there's a similar situation happening here.
Very much so. I mean, the entire book is about, and actually, if you think about it, right, one of the things that I argue is that Ezekiel could be, in essence, dealing with some dissociative identity disorder, and that there's kind of a slippage between the deity and the prophet. They kind of are hard to differentiate at times, right? And part of that is because he is supposed to emulate and also mediate in a lot of ways. But it's fascinating because there are really good discussions on how, if that is the case, we also need to do a trauma-informed reading of the deity. He's very much experiencing shame